Let's now move to our second topic, which is monopolies. So what is a monopoly? It's a market structure in which one firm controls the entire market and there are no close substitutes. The sole seller of goods, therefore, has greater market power because it's not competing with any other firms. And the implication is the market demand curve for this monopolist is the demand curve for the firm, where we saw in perfect competition that the market determines the price, and then if you're a firm, you're a price taker. In this case, you're a price maker. The monopoly may choose at what volume to supply and therefore dictates the price of the market. And however, there are limitations. It's not unlimited power. We'll get into that in a moment. Now we see that the monopolist demand curve is a downward sloping curve because they can choose high volumes and therefore have a low price. They can choose low volumes and have a high price. It's their choice because they're the only supplier. In this case, the price of 0 represents a Q of 0, and that's at point A. If they choose to go to point B, their price would drop, but their quantity would increase. And they have no constraints. They can go anywhere along this demand curve, and therefore the price is not fixed. The sources of power are many. It could be scale. They're so large no one else can compete because no one can get to their size. Secondly, they could be scope, that they have such a broad array of products that, again, no one can compete based on their cost structure given to them by their scope. There might be cost complementarities where they have an experience that one product assists another in its cost, and therefore the combination gives them a superior cost position. And finally, they may have legal protection, such as a patent or the right, an exclusive right to do business. A patent is like a drug discovery where if you want to cure cancer of that type, you've got one choice. A legal barrier might be your utilities providing gas to a community, and the community, the government, gives you a monopoly because there is no reason to have two gas companies in the same town. Let's look at something we've seen before. It's similar to the elasticity of demand we saw very early with a straight line. Well, here we have that an item here, demand curve. We see here, that's quantity. And remember unitary? Unitary, we are elastic up to the point of unitary, then inelastic below. The unitary is the point where the marginal revenue hits 0, which also means that's your point of maximum revenue. Because with every succeeding quantity you're selling here, you're still making money. You're making less money than you did. However, if you go beyond Q0, then the marginal revenue goes negative. So in this case, we want to be right at here if we want to maximize revenue. So again, this is not profit, this is revenue. To maximize revenue, we would be at the point where it's unitary elasticity. In this case, the monopoly is the market and they face this curve. The firm's revenue then looks like this. The inelastic portion, if we're graphing total revenue, not price, total revenue, we see that it rises all the way to the point of Q0. Beyond it, in the inelastic portion, we actually hurt ourselves. So there is one clear point to maximize revenue. So here is some math to go along with the graph. So the demand curve is an inverse demand function. We did this again previously, where price equals a function of quantity, and there's a negative slope. Total revenue then is price times quantity. In this case, P of Q times Q. And we end up with revenue equal AQ plus BQ squared. And this causes that bell-shaped curve that we saw in the total revenue curve. And marginal revenue, as you remember, I hope, first derivative is the first derivative of revenue. So marginal revenue is the revenue differentiated with respect to Q. And we reduce this revenue function to this marginal revenue function of A, the Q disappears, 2 times B times Q to the first power. So note that B is always negative because we're facing a downward sloping demand curve. We also recall elasticity. So marginal revenue is equal to price times 1 plus elasticity over elasticity. And where the marginal revenue is less than 0, then we're elastic, and where the marginal revenue is equal to 0, we're unitary, and then where margin revenue is less than 0, that is where the elasticity is between -1 and 0, and we have incentive to increase quantity. Let's see an example of a monopoly in action. Suppose that the inverse demand function is given by P equals 10 minus 2Q. What is the maximum price per unit the monopolist can charge to be able to sell 3 units? And what is the marginal revenue at that point? Finally, what's the optimal price for the monopoly? Answer: the maximum price the monopolist can charge is for 3 units is price equals to 10 minus 2 times 3 equals 4. The marginal revenue at that point is 10 minus 3 times 2 or equals negative 2. So in this case, we have a negative marginal revenue, so we have incentive to lower the price because we don't want to have negative marginal revenue. So revenues at 3 times 3 is 9. Maximum revenues is where marginal revenue equals 0. So if we set that 10 minus 2 times 2Q equals 0, we solve it and Q equals 2.5 units. Let's say units were in thousands, so you don't say what is a half unit. So in this case, 2.5, and the price is equal to 10 minus 2 times 2.5, or $5, and therefore revenues are 5 times 2.5, that's the quantity, equals 12.5. So we can see that at 3, we are making only revenues of 9. At the quantity of 2.5, we make revenues of 12.5. So a monopolist who has control would then choose to lower the quantity produced and therefore raise the price, and that would maximize their revenue. Now, in monopolies, like other business, revenue is vanity and profits are king. So we want to not just say, what's our maximum revenue? We want to say, where's our maximum profit if we're in a monopolist? So again, the guiding principle is marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So let's apply that with graphs first. In this case, we have the revenue function not being a straight line, but being a curve because we're facing a demand curve, not a straight given price. Our revenue, again, has the familiar shape where we have periods where our costs are favorable and the periods where we have diseconomies and our costs start rising. And the gap in between, similar to the marginal net benefit idea, is that the gap in between is where we make money. So the slope where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost is the profit maximization point. And that is similar to what we saw very early when we looked at benefits and costs and net benefits. Under monopoly, looking at it a different way, if we look at price and how that behaves over quantity as relates to the cost curves of marginal cost, and then also the demand and marginal revenue, we see this equilibrium. Remember, we will seek where the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue. And that's this intersection here, which sets this quantity, which also sets this price. So the sequence is as follows. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That sets the quantity, and the quantity then we translate back up to the demand curve, and that sets the price, which means this is starting to be the profit, right? We're seeing how that profit exists for the monopoly. And if the average total cost has this shape, then we could look at profit because the big rectangle, price times quantity, is revenue. This little rectangle here is after we subtract out this rectangle here, which is cost. So the big rectangle is revenue. This rectangle down here is cost, which squeezes out this shaded region, which is profit. So the thing to remember is the price minus the average total cost times the quantity equals profit. And that's the relationship we're going to be looking at as we evaluate the different options available to a monopoly. Actually, that formula holds for everybody, right? Because it's price minus your average total cost times the quantity of your sales. So this holds for all scenarios, but in this case, for the monopoly, they have just a lot more control. So monopoly pricing rule is the quantity for the monopoly is where the price of market equals the price where the quantity is your optimum quantity, namely where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. Here's an example with some formulas. So let's assume that we have an inverse demand function of 100 equals 2Q, and the cost function is 10 plus 2Q. What is the profit maximizing price, quantity, and profits? So again, we're not maximizing revenue in this case. We're now interacting revenue and cost. First, let's derive the marginal cost given quantity. It's 2 times 1 times Q to the 1 minus 1, because here's the cost. So the 10 disappears. 2 times 1, the power of q, times q to the 1 minus 1 equals 2. So this cost function boils down to a marginal cost of 2, which is the slope of that line. Next, the revenue is price times quantity. So again, we've given the price, and here multiply times quantity, and we end up with this expression, and we could derive the marginal revenue, which is equal to 100 minus 4q. The profit maximizing output is then found when we solve MC equals MR. In this case, 100 minus 4q equals 2, and q then becomes 24.5. Now that again is for the monopoly. The profit maximizing price then is we set the price equal to what the demand curve had for that particular quantity, which is 100 minus 2 times 24.5 equals 51. And now we can derive our maximum profit. Profit equals the price of 51 times the quantity, 24.5, minus, looking at the cost function, 10 plus 2 times 24.5. And the answer is 1,190 and 50 cents. Now, in this case, we have an unusual case. There is no supply curve because the monopolist can choose what to supply at what price. So the price is not determined by the competitors, but the price is determined by the monopolist's action against the demand curve. In this case, the market power that they receive means that the price will always be greater than marginal revenue equals marginal cost because they have the right to do so. So this is what makes monopolists so powerful and also contrary to societal interest, if you will, because the price will be set by the monopoly at a point where they make money. It's not set at a price where they make less and less profits down to zero, where the society benefits by lower prices and higher quantity. Monopolists will set higher price and sell at a lower quantity. What if they have more than one plant? So a multi-plant decision for a company, a monopoly in this case, is where they set the quantity for each of the plants. And how do they do that? In order to optimize their profits, they would set the quantity where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost of each of the two plants. So they would then balance the load between their plants such that they make maximum profits. So let's derive the multi-plant output rule. So if the marginal revenue of Q is the marginal revenue for Q equal to Q1 plus Q2, where 1 and 2 are plants, and let's say the marginal cost of Q1 is MC1 for Q1, and for plant 2 is MC2 of plant 2, then the profit maximizing rule for the two-plant monopoly is such that the marginal revenue faced by the firm, which is MR of Q, equals the marginal cost of plant 1, and it also equals the marginal cost of plant 2. Because if one plant had a higher cost, then why would you produce there? And if one has a lower cost, why wouldn't you shift volume there? So eventually that optimizing in your brain as a monopolist would have that marginal revenue equals the marginal cost of each of the plants. So that determines the mix of volume that you put through your two plants. Here are some implications for entry. A monopolist earns positive economic profits because, as we saw, they can set the price high enough for them to make some profit over their marginal costs. However, normally that would bring in more competition, but there are barriers, and that barrier allows the monopolist to reap economic profit, in other words, some excess profit. Monopolies then would continue over time as long as they have their market power. Now you might think that, oh, then there's a guarantee that monopolies make money. That's not true. We'll look at why a monopoly, even though they have dominance, doesn't make money or can have a situation where they don't make money. Here is an example how a monopolist can earn zero profit. Let's say that they're facing these curves: the demand, downward sloping, marginal revenue, and marginal cost. What if quantity for the monopolies, again set by MR equals to MC, is at this level, but their average total cost is also at that level? In this case, they would sell at P, which is established by the intersection of marginal revenue, marginal cost, right here, but P minus the average total cost is equal to 0, so they will make zero profit. And so this occurs where a firm may dominate this industry, but unfortunately, there's a combination of low demand and high costs, which means even though you dominate it, you can't make money. There's also a term called deadweight loss. This is a condition where the consumer and producer surplus is lost due to the monopolists making their optimal decision, namely constraining the quantity and increasing price. Here's how we'll build the story. First, you'll recall this is how monopolists set their price. MC equals MR sets the Q. The Q then sets the price, and this rectangle represents the revenue to the monopolist. I think you recall that. So let's pause that for a moment and say, what if this wasn't a monopoly? What would happen to the pricing and quantity if this were perfectly competitive? In this case, the firms would compete on the quantity until such time as the marginal cost equals the price. And that will drive down the price to this new equilibrium called Q competitive market. And this rectangle here results from perfect competition. So now let's compare what happens with those two. Because in this case, we see that this little triangle here represents the consumer surplus lost, because consumers would have bought all the way out to QC and captured this amount of additional consumer surplus. And producer surplus is also lost. So producer surplus equal to this triangle here is lost due to the quantity set by the monopoly. So the total deadweight loss is the combination of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus loss because of the monopoly pricing at QM.